Hello, good afternoon, or good morning, depending where you're tuning into with us this afternoon. Charlie and I are based on the West Coast, and so it's still morning here, not quite afternoon yet. Charlie is based in Washington State, and I am in Southern California in Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us today for our very first Tamron webinar with Image Master Charlie Voorhees. A couple of housekeeping notes to request. If your mic is not muted yet, please do so right now so that there won't be any audio feedback during the webinar. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to type them into the chat box and we'll get to them as many as we can at the end during a Q&A. So without further ado, here is Charlie Voorhees.
Hello everybody, my name is Charlie Voorhees. I'm a filmmaker, photographer, and Tamron Image Master. This class is called Considering DSLR Video and Finding Your Style. I own a small video production company in central Washington State. That's me on the far left with my dog named Bear. And then I have Alicia McKee, Jeremiah Higgins, and Aaron Joy Nash. And the four of us make up the company. I registered the company in 2004. I had just gotten out of film school. I went to Brooks Institute of Photography in Ventura, California. I was 21 years old. In this class, Considering DSLR Video and Finding Your Style, we're going to go over a few of the things that hopefully will help you bridge the gap between photography and filmmaking using the same camera. But real quickly, this is my disclaimer. I've been shooting DSLR video now since about 2005, and being in a small town in central Washington, I don't have a lot of resources to rent a lot of gear or to do a lot of things that you would typically do in the production world. So I've done a lot of DIY, I guess, innovation on trying to create gear that'll work well for me, in addition to just kind of coming up with methodologies to solve problems that I come across in the filmmaking world that may or may not be industry standard. So I understand there's a lot of ways to go about a lot of things, but this whole presentation is kind of built around my experience and some of the ways that I've solved a lot of the problems that I've been addressed, specifically kind of the commercial side of filmmaking. Photography versus DSLR filmmaking. They have a lot in common. There's also quite a bit in difference to each other. So hopefully I can kind of shed some light on what some of those differences are and how we can bridge the gap a little bit. Some of the fundamental similarities are the understanding of optics. Lenses are going to work the same on video mode on your SLR as they are in photography mode. And shutter speed and f-stops and ISO, fundamentally those are all going to work exactly the same way. And then just kind of some basic SLR knowledge. A lot of that's going to transfer over into the video mode. But some of the differences are, you're now going to be using a lot of motion, obviously, because, video captures motion. With photography, we use motion for things like slow shutter speed and, blurring out moving water or, streaking out different, elements like cars driving at night and things like that. But with video, you're using motion in every shot, and you're kind of continually capturing an image and applying composition to something that's moving within your frame. So it's just a slightly different way of thinking when you're shooting video versus shooting, photos. And also kind of the idea of sequential storytelling, taking one shot and putting it next to another shot and creating juxtaposition and kind of a sequence, and or shooting multiple angles of the same subject. And then we're also going to be talking about using audio and music. It's not a requirement, to use audio and music in video, but obviously a film is kind of an all-immersive experience that includes a lot of audio elements. And then also one of the big differences is, if you're a flash portrait photographer, a lot of that knowledge isn't necessarily going to translate into the video side of things. Then another area that we think a little differently in the world of video is exposure and how we think about exposure. For example, I have this frame from a short film that I did, and arguably it's underexposed, and this isn't the type of photo you would typically frame and put on your wall, but in a film it fits well, and it shapes the scene, and it drives an emotion. It's kind of a delicate moment, and you can almost hear what that scene would probably sound like if you were there. And so in film, you have the opportunity to explore exposure in a different way than with photography. In photography, we're always trying to get proper exposure, where in film you have the opportunity to kind of let things fall off a little bit, if that's what the scene calls for. Here's a few quick tips to get started, most specifically around setting up your camera and some of the different settings that you're going to be using. One of the big ones is that we're going to be shooting almost exclusively in manual mode. And so if you're a photographer and you're not already comfortable shooting in full manual, then I would suggest that's kind of where you start, is to get comfortable and make it second nature to know how to adjust your camera and compensate for different variables in manual mode. Another strong suggestion would be to use a two-way fluid video tripod head. A lot of photographers have a ball head or a three-way head, and that's great for photography, but video is going to make it very difficult to get smooth pan shots and tilt shots. Then you're going to want to consider how you'll use audio. Like I mentioned before, it's not a requirement that you start with audio. There's a lot of videos out there that are just kind of visual montages or silent films, but you're going to want to start exploring the different ways of capturing audio, and capturing audio on location versus adding audio later in your edit and applying music and things like that. This is a little field recorder that I've used many times out on location to capture some sounds that can sync up to my footage later. There's also ways of capturing audio straight into your camera. We won't get too involved with audio stuff right now, but that's certainly something that you'll need to consider. And then you're going to want to consider what frame rate you're shooting, and also just kind of have a basic understanding of how frame rates work. Here's a little chart down here that shows 60 frames per second versus 24 frames per second. Your camera in video mode is capturing a sequence of frames per second, and 24 frames per second is used pretty commonly for filmmaking, and Hollywood films are often captured and projected in 24 frames per second. And then 60 frames per second can be used for creating slow motion. So 60 frames per second shot captured at 1 second and then laid down on a 24-second timeline. The shot will actually turn into 2.5 seconds long. The real world 1 second now takes 2.5 seconds to play. Another thing you're going to want to consider is the 180-degree shutter rule. And essentially what this is you have your frame rate set, and then what you're going to want to do in video mode is to try to double your frame rate with your shutter speed. So as you can see in the chart, we've got 24 frames per second. You'd want to set your camera to 1/48th of a second. Now our SLR cameras don't actually have 1/48th, but we do have 1/50th. So that's what you'd actually want to set to. And then 30 frames per second, 1/60th, and so on and so forth. And the reason you want to do this is because when you're capturing images, what we're ultimately trying to do is emulate the way our naked eye sees the world. And so at 24 frames per second, if we capture each frame at 1/50th of a second, then there's going to be an equal amount of time that a frame is not being captured as to being captured. And your footage is going to become very smooth and fluid as motion is going through your frame. But if we're following the 180-degree shutter rule, now all of a sudden we're locking down our shutter speed, and we no longer have that component to work with when calibrating our exposure. That would then require that we add a fourth exposure variable. We're used to using f-stops and shutter speeds in ISO, but if we lock in our shutter speed, then we need to start using ND filters. And basically that's like putting sunglasses on the front of your camera. By adding that fourth variable and cutting down how much light comes through your lens with ND filters, you're able to still get proper exposure midday at 1/50th of a second. A really common ND filter that videographers use is called a variable ND filter, and it's very similar to like a polarizer where you can rotate it, and as you spin it, it gets darker and darker. And some of these filters can actually cut down about 8 stops of exposure. So it's really good to use a filter like this when shooting video. And then another thing to consider when you start shooting video is to think like an editor. What's the action in the shot? How will the scene stitch together? I showed you this central frame earlier in the presentation, but there's other shots around the sequence that I shot as well. And when you stitch these together, you can start telling, a small story. And so when we're shooting as a company, we often will shoot scenes, with a minimum of 3 shots. We call them 3-shot scenes. That way, all the B-roll that we shoot will have kind of a variety of angles that we can, stitch together and create a scene. So I'd like to walk you through 3 methods of production that we use. And I want to kind of explain how we use them and why we use them. The first one being a basic video setup. That's going to require a lot of adapting to the environment. And then there's more of a collaborative video setup. And in that, our hopes is that we can kind of control the environment and really take control of a scene and direct a scene to accomplish a certain goal. And then there's more of a cinema setup, and with that, you're creating an environment. If you have an idea for a short film, you're creating a scene from nothing. So number 1, adapting to the environment. This calls for a very basic and simple kind of run and gun style setup. In this case, I've got just a camera and a lens. And my go-to lens is the Tamron 2470. And this is kind of my cornerstone lens in terms of I always have it with me, and if I bring additional lens, it's because I want to go a little wider or I want to be able to zoom in a little more, but this is kind of the cornerstone of my production. The vibration compensation on it is amazing, so I'm comfortable shooting handheld. I'm comfortable taking it into pretty much any situation I want. And with a really basic setup, I'm able to put myself in pretty precarious situations and capture scenes as they're unfolding naturally, with very little disruption to the characters or the scene around me. I'm able to follow snowboarders and kind of get some angles and perspectives that you wouldn't normally get if you had a more elaborate camera setup. Going out on boats and going up on another cliff wall. I also have a motorcycle that I've outfitted to be able to kind of help me operate in this first method of production where I'm really just solo, run and gun. I'm able to work really quickly in really remote areas. This film that I made, it's called Primordial. What I was hoping to do was spend a few days in Yellowstone and try to capture what Yellowstone might look like without any people, or what it might look like before people were ever around. Now I was traveling by myself, and I wanted to have as simple of a production setup as possible, yet still have as much opportunity to get the type of footage I was hoping to capture. So I traveled really light. I had 1 SLR camera and 2 lenses. I had the Tamron 2470 G1 and the 7200 G1. And I also built this little time-lapse dolly. And essentially what it is just some angle iron welded together in a little cart with rollerblade wheels. And then I had this sprocket system that I took off of an old bicycle, and I anchored it down and then coiled some string around it, and then I can click it. 1 little click at a time will advance the rope about 1 millimeter. With that, I was able to shoot some really cool time-lapse dollies, and essentially those are a series of photos stitched together to create, a video clip later. There's a shot of it in action. And eventually I got a new slider that I was able to operate, all by myself in really remote areas. It's great to be able to dynamically move your camera through space in a very fluid and mechanical way. The second mode of production requires a lot of collaboration, both with the client and with a crew. Oftentimes there's multiple cameras, there's lights, there's audio, and there's a lot of variables that you have to control in order to accomplish your client's goals. So your kit is going to start growing. You're going to have lights, you're going to have audio, you might use some sliders. Things on your camera are going to start getting a little bit more elaborate. You might have a monitor, you might run audio straight into your camera. This is a shot of my team and I recording a guy at a gym, giving a little delivery straight to camera. Jeremiah there in the green hat, he's running double system audio, so he's got the microphone on a big boom pole and he's recording the audio file straight to that little doohickey on his hip there. Our little helper on the left, he's clapping the scene so we can sync our files later. And here's a little interview shot for a documentary we're working on. This is a 2-light setup, and you'll also notice he has a little lav mic hooked up to his lapel there. So there's a lot of components going into just capturing a basic interview that require additional gear and crew members. So as the scope of the project grows, then often so does the team. And so in this second method of production, I often immediately will consider my team as being part of it. And then you move into the third method of production where you're creating an environment. And I chose this particular frame because this short film took place in the 80s, and so we needed to scout locations and props and wardrobe that would help, kind of build this scene that's supposed to take place in the 80s. And with that, you're going to have your basic core team, but you're also probably going to need a few more, team members. So when you're working in the third method of production, when you're shooting in the third method of production, not only is your set going to get a little bit more elaborate with props and gear, but your camera is going to start getting built out a little bit more and more. And as you build your camera out, what that's really doing is creating more opportunity for collaboration. You can start adding additional monitors, you can add follow focus, you can add additional components that some of your crew can help you control. And like I mentioned earlier, there's the variable ND filter. And on the front of this matte box, there's a filter tray where you can slide in different ND filters. And what's nice about this setup is that now you have the flexibility of using all the lenses in your collection, where with the variable ND filter, it has a very specific thread diameter. And so that might only be useful on a couple lenses. And you can get step-down rings, but with this tray system, you can just slide the matte box out further and use all of your lenses. Like I mentioned before, it's a lot like just putting sunglasses on the front of your camera. All this is doing is cutting down how much light enters your lens, so you can keep your shutter speed at 1/50th of a second. Now, when a lot of people think about starting to shoot video, I think in their mind that they start to imagine how elaborate it gets, and they get really intimidated by all the things that they need to learn going from photography to video. And I think that a scene like this is what they start to kind of visualize, thinking they just don't want to deal with all that stuff, or that's so much to learn. As I showed earlier in the presentation, it really can be as simple as just going out with your camera, and just like you would have been shooting photos, you're just rolling clips. I'd like to share my production method spectrum with you. And this is something that I think about pretty frequently on pretty much every job I go on. I try to imagine where a production is going to land on this, and it helps me decide gear, and it helps me figure out how much help I'm going to need. And we use this spectrum a lot even when pricing out projects and just thinking about how elaborate the logistics are going to be. Most of my time, though, I will say that I'm somewhere between the phase 1 and phase 2 of the spectrum, where I do a lot of quick run and gun candid style production, and then sometimes we'll need a little bit more extensive production efforts where I'll bring on additional crew and I'll build out my camera a little bit more elaborately and do a lot more pre-production development. But the large majority of our company is built around our ability to work in this quick run and gun, think on your feet style of production. When you think about production and kind of finding your sweet spot, what style of production is most intriguing to you? So where do you see yourself on the spectrum? I think for anybody who's just getting into video, it's helpful to know what style of production is most attractive to you, because each phase requires a slightly different way of thinking. As both photographers and filmmakers, we're kind of always walking this fine line of form versus content. And there's all sorts of new technologies that are always coming out, and there's a lot of people that immediately adopt this new technology and start applying it to their production. But it's important that while we do that, we're still giving as much, if not more, attention back to the content. This brings me to this chart of the left brain, right brain functions. And I think generally speaking, a lot of people try to take sides, and they say, oh, I'm very left-brained or I'm very right-brained. But I'm of the belief that we're a combination of both, and I think that there's just a different ratio for everybody. But I think to be successful as a filmmaker and photographer, it's important to embrace both sides of the brain and think very creatively, but also think very logically. So I think with all this said, so a lasting question that I want to leave you with is, how do you want to work? What method of production do you want to employ? I had mentioned that I spend a lot of time in that first method of production shooting with a very simple camera setup, and that's by design. I feel most connected to a scene when I'm not getting distracted by gear or I'm not messing with troubleshooting different pieces of gear. I like things to just be very simple and to work, and only using additional gear when the production really calls for it. Finding that sweet spot where you feel most comfortable, that's where you're going to be most creative. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Charlie Voris. This has been Considering DSLR Video and Finding Your Style. And a huge thanks to Tamron for putting this all together. I would love to answer any questions that you might have. I'm most active on Instagram, so if you want to reach out to me there, I'd be happy to get back as quick as I can. And then I know that Tamron will be posting some links to the videos and things like that, and if I don't actually know how it works, but I'm assuming that you can post comments or questions on some of those posts, and I'll engage with those as well. So yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with everybody. I wish I could see you all face to face. I definitely prefer doing talks and presentations live, but this is what we have for now. So thanks for hanging in there with me.
All right. Thank you, Charlie. Again, sorry, we apologize to everybody for the sound and audio technical difficulties. Thanks for your patience for those that did stick around. We will be recording this and posting it online. And now we will open it up for some Q&A, and I will scroll back up to the chat box. Thank you for your questions. And let's see here. Are you ready, Charlie?
Sure, yeah.
Let's see. Just checking, my sound is good, better? You can see me and audio is okay?
Sound good to me, yep.
You are good, Janet.
Thank you. Yeah, because some people earlier said I was choppy as well. And again, so sorry. All right, so Michael Henson asks, what is your favorite Tamron lens?
Well, I mentioned in the thing that my cornerstone lens is the 2470 G2. And I suppose that's my favorite just because of how frequently I use it. But with that said, I feel like a superhero when I get a shoot with the 150-600. The wildlife specifically that I can, capture and just get connected to through that lens it's just a magical experience for me. So I'm actually going to claim that that's my favorite lens, but I don't use it all that frequently, especially for commercial work, because that would be silly to shoot an interview or something with that lens.
All right, and let's see what's next. Who's next here? Okay, from Art Wong. So why DSLR specific since mirrorless is becoming more the compact option?
I don't have a good answer as to why, other than I just haven't bought a mirrorless camera yet, but I do think I will. Ergonomically, I really like a full-bodied camera because I have really large hands. TMI. But I certainly don't have anything against mirrorless bodies. I think the technology is amazing, and I've shot on them a few times, and it's just a matter of time until I buy one. So I don't have any reason as to why I'm not using them, other than it's just not in my repertoire yet.
All right, thank you. And okay, I'm scrolling down. Let's see here. Again, thank you for all your suggestions on for the next round. We will take, for those of you that suggested we turn off the presenter camera, we will definitely try that on the next round. Thank you. Let's see. Scrolling. I miss it. Okay. Here is from Kay Conley. Do you have a link to the ball head that you used?
I have a two-way head. I don't have a ball head. But I do have a link, sure, that I can include to the two-way video head that I use.
Okay.
Actually, I'm going to jump in as well. I have a question here that I'm seeing. I'm going all the way down to the bottom here. What makes a successful film for you, Charlie? And how do you choose a passion project?
Ooh,
That's
those are good
a good
questions.
one.
So the successful film, I suppose for me, I'm going to speak a little bit in terms of client work specifically, because that's so much of what we do. But um, I'd like to think that we come really close to a client's vision, and we do that through really, really intentional listening through the pre-production phase of things. But to me, what's most successful is when the client, is sort of stunned at the end and just thought, this is way better than I ever imagined, or, that gave me chills, or, sometimes they cry at first screening. And, for me, that's just when things like that happen, I know that I hit really close to home, and that I did my work well in terms of interpreting what the client was hoping to accomplish, and then putting my own efforts and intention into making that happen. So I really like to know when the client feels happy with what we put together. And then for my own personal projects, I like to challenge myself, and a lot of my passion projects, I'll admit, come up short for me, but that's sort of by design, because I like to try, to maybe try new territory with some of the films that I do, most specifically in topic, or like the short films that I create, for example, are usually around topics that I'm really afraid of, or maybe give me nightmares, if you will. And so I just want to explore that through an art medium, and so I use short films in that regard. I can I can share a link in the description of an example of that. And then I also just, wildlife and nature is something that I spend a lot of time exploring, and so a lot of my, I guess, passion projects end up being revolved around that. But it's more specifically because I just really like spending time in spaces like that. And while I'm out there, I capture stuff and then edit it to music that engages with me. Unfortunately, I don't have as much time to do as many passion projects as I'd like, so hopefully that'll change at some point.
All right, and what video editing software do you use?
We're currently using Adobe Premiere. We have the Adobe Creative Suite. In my earlier years, though, I was a Final Cut Pro 7 editor, and then I left 7 when X came out and went over to Premiere. But I understand now that X has gotten a lot better. So I'm not editing on X now, but I wouldn't be opposed to that. And I know it's a great editing system. But Adobe Premiere is what we currently use here in the company.
Let's see here. Could you explain the use of the sled in the time-lapse photography?
Did I, or could I?
Could you?
Oh yes. So yeah, what I created was a track that this little cart with rollerblade wheels can roll along, and then at the end I put this bicycle sprocket gear system, and I kind of anchored it down to where when you click it, similar to when you pedal backwards on a bike, it's got these little clicks. When you click that one spot at a time, it'll coil up the rope about 1 millimeter at a time. And so what I would do is set my camera on the intervalometer, to fire every 3 or 4 seconds, and then I would click the wheel between every single frame. So it would go click, click, and I would, over the course of about an hour, hour and a half, I would roll the cart across the cart while capturing, cloud movement or something else happening. I understand there's motorized dollies that do that, and I have one, but I will openly admit that I far prefer the manual version mostly because it connects me to the scene, and I get to sit there and be part of the whole process. And also, I don't need any batteries, and I don't need cables to be faulty, and I don't have any apps to fail. It's just very straightforward. So if you have the patience for it, I'd recommend figuring out a way to put together a manual time-lapse dolly. It's super fun.
I have a question here from Ronald. He goes, starting out, how do you acquire clients? And I know you touched on this a little bit, but how do you acquire clients?
I might have a slightly controversial answer, depending on how your community is with, competitive clientele. But clients want to see portfolio, and if you don't have a portfolio, then you need to build one. And so that might mean for the first few, offering up your services either in trade or for free, just to start building portfolio. And that's giving you, real world practical content to practice your editing and to, finesse your process enough to feel confident to start charging money for it. What I will say though, I mean, Vortex Productions was registered in 2004, and it wasn't until 2013 that I had enough clientele and enough confidence built up to where I felt like I could do it as a full-time job. And I know that's maybe a little discouraging to hear, that it takes 9 or 10 years, but that's not abnormal for industry, professionals, to need a good 10 years before they're considered a professional or an expert in the field. So if you're thinking about video as a career, you got to do your time, and you got to, I guess, kind of spend time being as opportunistic as you can to have real world experience. And of course, I mean, there's a lot of people out there that don't want to spend very much for videos. So work for cheap for a while and work for trade, and try to assist on other production companies' projects, just to learn that process and build your portfolio. But there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just kind of, a matter of what you feel confident doing. There's a lot of people too that start with weddings. There's a lot of really amazing wedding videographers out there, but they're expensive. And so by offering a kind of a lower tier price point, you can certainly start acquiring a lot of work by doing weddings and doing small kind of mom and pop shop commercials and things like that. Yeah, it's not a quick, easy thing, and it doesn't happen overnight, but if you're into it and you're committed, you can grow it.
All right, let's see here, from Jonathan. Do you typically dual record audio, or do you use any adapters to put XLR mic into your camera?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Quite often we'll do maybe a lav mic. Well, let me back up. If I'm by myself, then I'll oftentimes just do a lav mic, and I'll plug in just the 1/8" TRS cable straight into my camera, and I'll get the audio there. And I understand an XLR adapter would, give you a slightly better audio quality, but that's just another component that I don't particularly want to deal with. And so when higher quality audio is of utmost importance, then I have an additional person, and I do double system sound, like Jeremiah in that picture with the boom pole. He has his own audio recorder strapped to his hip, and so we're slating at the beginning of a shot, we're syncing our files later, and he's recording with, through XLR cables into his field recorder. So I do a little bit of both. It's just like I had mentioned on that kind of spectrum, we sort of analyze what each shoot is going to require, and sometimes audio is just not quite as important as other times, and so we make kind of a judgment call based on what kind of gear we're going to send out in the field. So I don't do any one thing all the time, if that makes any sense.
Okay, let's see. How are we doing on time, Ken?
I think we could take one more, because we still have a few people listening, so we'll do one more question.
I'm still looking here. Unless you have one.
I think I got one. We'll
Just
go
got
with no, we got a two-parter here. Why the 180 rule?
Oh yeah, I
And
saw that.
then what is the thought behind doubling the frame rate as opposed to shooting at say what does that say, 200th of a second? So we could start with why the 180 rule, because some people might not even know what that is. So
Sure, sure. And that, unfortunately, is somewhat of an elaborate topic that I just didn't want to get too deep into. But the 180 rule is basically by design trying to mimic what our human eye sees naturally. And so when things are moving fast in our field of view, we're not getting a super sharp capture of an object as it's passing through our field of view. And so we're very used to seeing the world that way. And so when you're capturing footage, if you're using, if you're capturing something at 24 frames per second and you shoot at 1/50th of a second, then what's happening is that you're capturing an image exactly for as the same amount of time that you're not capturing an image. And there's some image blur that's happening in there. And then while it's advancing from one frame to the next, there's an equal duration of time from one frame to the other. So the motion feels very fluid across the screen, very similar to how our eye interprets the world. But if you shoot with a really fast shutter speed and a slower frame rate, what's going to happen is you're going to capture a really sharp image, and then there's going to be a gap of time, and then another really sharp image and a gap of time. And it's going to have this kind of stroby stutter feel to it. Now, given that's an effect that can actually be intentional. The opening scene to Saving Private Ryan, for example, was shot with really fast shutter speed to give this really jarring combat-like feel. But that's the effect that comes out of shooting really fast shutter speeds at a slower frame rate, is you get this kind of stuttering sequence of motion. So our way to try to regulate that the best we can is to create the same amount of capture as non-capture, and then capture and non-capture, to create just the smoothest image across the screen. As far as the why not 1/200th, I think it's somewhat of the same answer, unless for some reason you're capturing 100 frames per second. 1/200th would actually be the ideal shutter speed to use. But generally speaking, you're going to want to try to just double your shutter speed based on your frame rate. Now, given these are all just suggestions and not firm rules, because as you start changing things and doing it a little differently, it's going to give a different effect to your video, and that might be the intention. So I think more than anything, I want to encourage people to consider why their settings are what they are, and hopefully it's because of a creative reason, not a logistical reason. That's sort of the balance that we're looking for. Was that both parts? Did I answer that?
Sorry.
I think so. I think you're good.
We'll squeeze in one more question from Dave. What image resolution should be used for broadcast video, say a commercial, for example?
We do actually quite a bit of 30-second spots that end up on broadcast, and I have yet to find a network that has required 4K. Pretty much everybody so far is still primarily using 1080. And with that, you could probably even get away with a lot of networks accepting 720, which I'm not recommending 720 resolution. I would say 1080 is probably the lowest we should go this day and age. So yeah, 1080 HD is kind of the standard. There are some networks that if you have a 4K file, they're happy to take it and they'll run it at full res, hoping that some people have their 4K TVs and they can accept that. But from my understanding, the bandwidth isn't, or the infrastructure isn't set up to having 4K being a requirement just yet. But we do capture most of our B-roll and most of our projects in 4K, and then we'll scale them down if we need to. But most of our master exports are in 4K.
All right, let's see. All right, I think that's about all the questions we have. There's some that I didn't get to. It's probably because it's already been answered, or if you missed the first part of the webinar. This is being recorded and it will be posted online. I know a lot of you did ask that if it's going to be posted, and yes, it will be. Other than that, thank you for attending, and we'll see you at the next one on Friday with David Akubian. Please join us on Friday. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.